Have you ever watched someone completely shut down the moment a conversation gets too real? Picture this. Someone shares their deepest fear, extends their hand in trust, and the other person responds like they've just been handed a live grenade. This fascinating phenomenon reveals exactly how avoidance turn vulnerability into a threat, transforming moments of potential connection into battlegrounds of emotional survival. The human mind possesses an extraordinary ability to protect itself, sometimes in ways that seem completely backwards to everyone else. When someone with an avoidant attachment style encounters vulnerability, whether their own or someone else's, their brain doesn't register it as an opportunity for closeness. Instead, every alarm bell starts ringing, every defense system activates, and what should feel like intimacy suddenly feels like imminent danger. This reaction happens so automatically that even the avoidant person might not realize they're doing it. Understanding this pattern changes everything about how relationships work, why some conversations feel impossible, and why certain people seem to run away just when things get good. The stakes here aren't just about better communication or fewer arguments. This is about understanding the invisible forces that can make or break the deepest human connections. When vulnerability becomes a threat in someone's mind, it affects every relationship they'll ever have, every chance at true intimacy, and every opportunity for genuine emotional growth. But here's where things get really interesting, and perhaps a bit unsettling. The very thing that could heal an avoidant person's deepest wounds is the same thing their mind has learned to fear most. It's like being desperately thirsty but seeing water as poison. This creates a tragic loop where the medicine looks exactly like the disease and the solution appears to be the problem itself. The confirmation bias plays a crucial role in this dynamic, acting like a detective who only looks for evidence that supports what they already believe. An avoidant person's mind becomes incredibly skilled at finding proof that vulnerability leads to pain, that opening up results in rejection, and that emotional safety is just an illusion. Every small disappointment becomes massive evidence. Every moment of discomfort proves their theory correct. Every awkward pause in conversation confirms their worst fears about what happens when people get too close. Yet the most heartbreaking part of this entire process is that underneath all these defenses lives someone who wants connection just as desperately as anyone else. The avoidance strategy isn't about not caring. It's about caring so much that the risk of losing feels unbearable. So the mind creates elaborate systems to avoid the very thing the heart craves most. Think of Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl, who often pushed people away just when they got closest to seeing who she really was underneath all the glamour and bravado. This transformation of vulnerability into threat doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without reason. But once you understand how this mental magic trick works, everything about avoidant behavior starts making perfect sense. The seemingly irrational becomes logical, the frustrating becomes understandable, and what looked like rejection reveals itself as protection. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Sarah met David at a coffee shop on a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday, with no hint that her entire understanding of relationships was about to crumble. David had this way of listening that made words flow like water, and conversations with him felt like discovering rooms in her own house she never knew existed. For 3 months they talked about everything except the things that mattered most: books, movies, work drama, family holiday disasters. Safe territory where no one's heart was on the line. Then came the night when Sarah's grandmother passed away, and she found herself calling David at 2 in the morning, tears making her words barely understandable. David didn't just listen, he showed up at her apartment with terrible coffee and the kind of presence that makes grief feel less lonely. Something shifted between them that night. something that made Sarah's chest feel warm and terrified at the same time. The walls she'd spent years building suddenly felt paper thin. The next morning, Sarah woke up with the strangest feeling, like she'd left her front door wide open all night in a dangerous neighborhood. David texted asking how she was doing, and instead of feeling cared for, she felt exposed. Every kind word he'd said the night before now felt like evidence he'd seen too much, knew too much, had too much power to hurt her. Her mind started cataloging all the ways this could go wrong, all the reasons why letting someone this close was basically handing them a roadmap to her destruction. But here's where Sarah's story takes an unexpected turn that reveals something crucial about how avoidant minds work. Instead of simply pulling back, Sarah's brain got creative. She started finding flaws in David that hadn't bothered her before. His laugh was too loud. His jokes weren't that funny. The way he stirred his coffee was somehow annoying. Like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, except in reverse. Sarah became obsessed with finding reasons why David wasn't right for her, building a case against connection instead of for it. The availability heuristic kicked in with devastating precision, making every relationship failure Sarah had ever witnessed feel immediately relevant and threatening. Her parents' divorce, her sister's messy breakup, that couple from college who seemed perfect until they imploded spectacularly. All these memories suddenly felt like warnings, like her mind's way of saying, see what happens when you trust someone completely. Meanwhile, all the successful, lasting relationships she knew became invisible, irrelevant, statistical anomalies that proved nothing about her situation. Sarah began what can only be described as an emotional investigation, searching for evidence that David would eventually leave, betray her trust, or reveal himself to be someone completely different than who he appeared to be. She analyzed his text response times like a forensic scientist. She interpreted his need for alone time as rejection. She turned his genuine compliments into manipulation tactics. Every gesture of love became proof of ulterior motives. The tragic irony unfolded slowly, like watching someone throw away a winning lottery ticket because they're convinced it's counterfeit. David, confused by Sarah's sudden distance, tried harder to connect, which only made Sarah more convinced that something was wrong. His increased attention felt like pressure. His questions about her feelings felt like interrogation. His attempts to understand her withdrawal felt like invasion. What started as Sarah protecting herself from potential hurt became Sarah creating the very abandonment she feared most. The story reaches its climax on a rainy Thursday evening when David, exhausted by trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand, finally asked Sarah directly what was happening between them. This moment of vulnerability, of David essentially saying, "Help me understand how to love you better," triggered every defense mechanism Sarah possessed. She heard his question not as an invitation to deeper connection, but as an ultimatum, a trap, a demand for more than she could safely give. The evening ended with Sarah telling David she needed space, using words like complicated and not ready that meant everything and nothing at the same time. David left confused and hurt, and Sarah felt simultaneously relieved and devastated. She'd successfully protected herself from the risk of being abandoned by doing the abandoning first. But the victory felt hollow, like winning a war by destroying everything worth fighting for. Yet this wasn't the end of Sarah's story, because understanding how vulnerability becomes a threat is the first step toward transforming that threat back into what it was always meant to be, an opportunity for genuine human connection. Now, if you recognize yourself in Sarah's story, or if someone you care about seems to turn love into danger, there are specific ways to work with this pattern instead of against it. The first step requires understanding that when vulnerability feels like a threat, the logical response is to fight, flee, or freeze. Trying to force someone past these defenses is like trying to convince someone to pet a growling dog by insisting the dog is friendly. The fear might be irrational, but the person experiencing it needs a different approach. Start by making vulnerability feel safer through consistency and patience, rather than intensity and urgency. Think of it like training a nervous rescue animal. Sudden movements, even loving ones, can trigger panic. Instead of grand gestures or deep emotional conversations, focus on small, reliable actions that build trust slowly. Show up when you say you will. Keep promises, especially small ones. Let your actions demonstrate safety over time rather than trying to convince with words. Create what therapists call a secure base by being predictably available without being overwhelming. This means not pushing for more closeness when someone pulls back, but also not disappearing when they seem to want space. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris, who learned to navigate complex relationship dynamics by staying engaged while respecting boundaries, find ways to remain present without being intrusive. Send a simple text that doesn't require a response. Leave space for the other person to come toward you, rather than always being the one moving closer. When someone does share something vulnerable, resist the urge to make it a bigger moment than it needs to be. Avoidant minds are watching for signs that vulnerability leads to chaos, drama, or demands for more emotional exposure. Instead of responding with intense gratitude or excitement about the breakthrough, treat these moments like they're normal and safe. Acknowledge what was shared, respond appropriately, then let the conversation flow naturally rather than camping out in the emotional territory you've been given access to. Practice what relationship experts call emotional regulation around rejection and distance. When someone with avoidant tendencies pulls back, they're often testing whether you'll become anxious, angry, or demanding, which would confirm their belief that closeness leads to problems. Instead, stay calm and consistent. Don't chase, but don't disappear either. Think of Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl, who learned that sometimes the most powerful response to someone's emotional distance is confident, non-reactive presence. Here's something crucial that most people get backwards. Don't try to convince an avoidant person that vulnerability is safe by explaining why it should feel safe. Their fear isn't based on logic, so logic won't fix it. Instead, demonstrate safety through your responses to their vulnerability. When they share something difficult, don't make them regret it by turning it into a therapy session or a relationship milestone celebration. Just be a safe person to tell things to, and let that experience accumulate over time. Address the confirmation bias directly by being aware that an avoidant person's mind is actively looking for evidence that you'll hurt them, leave them, or use their openness against them. This means being extra careful about your words and actions during times of stress or conflict. The same comment that wouldn't bother a secure person might feel devastating to someone who's already convinced that closeness leads to pain. This doesn't mean walking on eggshells, but it does mean being thoughtful about how you handle disagreements and disappointments. Work on your own attachment security, because interacting with avoidant patterns can trigger anxiety, frustration, and the urge to force connection that actually pushes people further away. The more secure you become, the less reactive you'll be to someone else's defenses, and the safer you'll feel to be around. Secure people don't take avoidant behavior personally, which paradoxically makes it safer for avoidant people to gradually let their guard down. If you're the one who turns vulnerability into a threat, start by simply noticing when it happens without trying to change it immediately. Awareness comes before transformation, and judging yourself for having these reactions will only make them stronger. Pay attention to what vulnerability feels like in your body. Does your chest tighten? Do you feel like running? Does your mind start generating reasons why the person sharing is somehow dangerous or manipulative? Challenge your confirmation bias by actively looking for evidence that contradicts your fears about vulnerability and closeness. Keep a mental or actual list of times when opening up led to positive outcomes, when people responded to your vulnerability with care, or when relationships got better rather than worse after difficult conversations. Your mind will resist this exercise because it contradicts the protective story it's been telling, but consistent practice can gradually shift the pattern. Start practicing vulnerability in very small, low-risk situations before attempting it in your most important relationships. Share minor preferences, small disappointments, or gentle opinions with people who feel relatively safe. Notice that most people don't use these small revelations against you, don't make you regret sharing, and don't suddenly have power to destroy you. Let these experiences build evidence that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to catastrophe. Most importantly, remember that healing avoidant patterns takes time and usually happens in cycles rather than straight lines. There will be progress followed by setbacks, openness followed by withdrawal, hope followed by fear. This isn't failure. It's how change works when you're rewiring deeply ingrained protective patterns. Be patient with yourself and others who are doing this difficult work of learning to see love as safety rather than danger. The journey from turning vulnerability into a threat towards seeing it as an opportunity for connection isn't just about changing relationship patterns. It's about reclaiming the fundamental human experience of being known and loved for who you truly are, not just for the carefully constructed version you present to the world. Every time someone chooses to stay present with their fear instead of running from intimacy, they're not just healing their own wounds. They're contributing to a world where emotional courage becomes more common than emotional hiding. Sarah's story didn't end with David walking away on that rainy Thursday evening. 6 months later, after Sarah had spent time understanding her own patterns and David had learned about avoidant attachment styles, they ran into each other at the same coffee shop where they'd first met. This time, when Sarah felt the familiar urge to find flaws and create distance, she recognized what her mind was doing. Instead of following the old script, she did something revolutionary. She told David exactly what was happening inside her head. The conversation that followed wasn't perfect or movie magical. There were awkward pauses, moments of confusion, and the kind of messy honesty that makes people want to hide under tables. But something different happened this time. David didn't run when Sarah explained her fears. Sarah didn't disappear when David expressed his hurt from months before. They sat in the discomfort together, two people choosing connection over protection, vulnerability over safety, truth over the comfortable lies that keep people apart. Their relationship today isn't a fairy tale, because real transformation doesn't create perfection. Sarah still sometimes feels that familiar panic when conversations get too deep. David still sometimes wonders if he's saying the wrong thing or moving too fast. But now they have tools, understanding, and most importantly, the shared commitment to see vulnerability as an invitation rather than an invasion. They've learned that emotional safety isn't the absence of fear. It's the presence of someone who won't run when things get real. This is what becomes possible when we stop letting our attachment patterns run our lives unconsciously and start making conscious choices about how we want to love and be loved. It's not about becoming someone different. It's about becoming who you already are underneath all the protective strategies that once served you but now limit you. Every avoidant person has a heart that wants connection. Every anxious person has wisdom about when to create healthy boundaries. Every secure person has moments of doubt and fear. We're all more alike than our attachment styles might suggest. The choice to transform vulnerability from threat to gift doesn't just change romantic relationships. It changes friendships, family dynamics, professional interactions, and most importantly, the relationship you have with yourself. When you stop being afraid of your own emotional truth, you stop projecting that fear onto others. When you learn to stay present with difficult feelings, you become someone others can trust with their difficult feelings. When you discover that vulnerability doesn't destroy you, you become living proof that emotional courage is possible. Start today, not with grand gestures or dramatic changes, but with small acts of emotional honesty that feel manageable and safe. Notice when your mind transforms someone's openness into evidence of weakness or manipulation. Pay attention to the moments when your own vulnerability wants to emerge, and consider letting it, even in tiny ways. Practice responding to others' emotional truth with presence rather than advice, curiosity rather than judgment, patience rather than urgency. Remember that changing attachment patterns is both deeply personal work and inherently relational healing. You can't do it completely alone, and you can't force someone else to do it. But you can create the conditions where growth becomes possible. You can be the kind of person who makes vulnerability feel safer for others, and you can seek out people who help vulnerability feel safer for you. This is how attachment security spreads, one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of choosing connection over protection at a time. The world needs people who are brave enough to be real, strong enough to be gentle, and wise enough to know that our deepest wounds often contain our greatest gifts to others. When you transform vulnerability from a threat into a bridge toward authentic human connection, you're not just healing your own heart, you're contributing to a future where emotional courage becomes as common as emotional hiding is today, where love becomes refuge rather than battleground, where being truly known feels like coming home rather than entering enemy territory.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.